Hey guys, tonight we begin with something different, something quieter. This is not a story of battles, not the kind of history written in parades or carved on monuments. This is the kind of history that lingers in silence, in corners most people never look at. A history soft enough to drift into your thoughts as you close your eyes, but unsettling enough to keep your dreams awake. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe so that these forgotten voices can travel farther. And in the comments, share where you are and the exact time you're listening. I always imagine those tiny dots across the world glowing in the dark, each one of you listening quietly, together, though apart. Now, let us walk down into the dark. The torchlight flickers low against damp stone, its flame bowing as though even fire knows it does not belong here. You step into the dungeon, though you cannot remember how you arrived. The air is heavy, wet with the scent of iron, mildew, and something that has long ago died. The walls are slick, sweating as though the very stones themselves feel the suffering they have witnessed. A narrow corridor stretches out, darker than night, its silence broken only by faint drips of water somewhere deep within. Yet if you listen long enough, you realise it isn't silence at all, it's whispers. The whispers of men and women long gone, of sentences that were carried out not with swiftness, but with slowness. Not with mercy, but with invention. Death itself would have been a kindness here. Instead, this was a place where bodies broke slowly, and souls had time to know every stage of despair. You run your hand along the wall, and the stone feels uneven. Not natural, no. Grooves carved by fingernails that clawed and clawed, hoping to scrape open a way to freedom. Some lines are shallow, frantic and quick. Others are deep, carved over days, perhaps weeks, as hands wore down to bone and still tried. They remain here like scars, the last testament of those who whispered before you. Dungeons were not simply prisons, they were stages, theatres of cruelty. In the Middle Ages, in castles across Europe, beneath the great banquet halls and chapels, below the floors where nobles feasted and drank, there were rooms designed for silence. Or rather, for screams so muffled by stone that no one above would be disturbed. Down here, justice was not a verdict. It was an art form. The punishments that waited in these shadows were not designed to kill swiftly. They were designed to humiliate, to terrify, to linger, to teach those who survived, if they survived at all, that pain was not simply something the body felt. Pain could become the very rhythm of your existence, a heartbeat measured by each new cruelty. Imagine the prisoner's first step into the dungeon. They would be dragged, often blindfolded, down spiral staircases where torchlight thinned and air thickened. Each step was a descent not just into stone, but into hopelessness. The guards who brought them rarely spoke. They did not need to. The dungeon itself gave its own welcome. Cold seeped through the shoes, the kind of cold that crawls up the legs and into the spine, the kind of cold that never leaves. And then there was the sound. Not shouting, not even crying, but the low groan of those who had already been here too long. Shackles clinking when a prisoner shifted. A cough in the dark, ragged, wet. A sob muffled by someone too exhausted to carry it through. For those newly arrived, this sound was a prophecy. They did not yet know what was waiting for them, but they knew it was worse than death. The punishments varied, but all shared one truth. They were meant to be remembered. Take the oubliette, for example, a word from the French oublier, meaning to forget. The oubliette was no grand chamber. It was a hole, often bottle-shaped, with a narrow top and a wide bottom. Prisoners were lowered in, sometimes with rope, other times simply dropped. And there they remained. No standing room, no space to stretch, only stone pressing in from all sides. A place designed to erase the prisoner not just from society, but from existence itself. The only food might be scraps, tossed down occasionally. The only company, rats, damp, and the slow unraveling of the mind. Listen closely, and you can almost hear the whispers arising from such pits. Not shouts of rebellion, not curses toward their captors, but the slow murmuring of a mind unraveling. Words repeated to remember who they once were. Names recited so they would not forget their own. Memories turned into lullabies, spoken aloud until even those faded. Down there, death was not given. It had to be begged for. And often, it came too late. But oubliettes were only one cruelty. The dungeon was home to many. Chains hung from ceilings, not for confinement alone, but for suspension. Bodies pulled upward, arms wrenched from sockets, left dangling until the weight of the prisoner's own body did what ropes and blades could not. And still, this was not execution, it was spectacle. Guards and torturers would enter not always to kill, but to continue, to keep the body alive enough to suffer further. The wheel, the rack, the chair, studded with iron spikes, all these would appear in later chapters of cruelty. But here, in the dungeon, the punishments began with silence. Starvation was the simplest. It cost nothing, required no tools. A prisoner might be left with just enough food to keep them from dying, but never enough to satisfy. Hunger clawed at them day after day until they were no longer themselves. Hunger stripped them of dignity, made them beg, made them grovel, made them forget everything except the gnawing inside their stomachs. And hunger had a companion, thirst. Dungeons were damp, yes, but the water that pooled in corners was foul, poisoned by filth. To drink was to risk sickness. To resist was to let the throat dry, lips crack, tongue swell until words could no longer form. Some prisoners clawed the walls not for escape, but to scrape the wet stone and taste just a drop. The whispers you hear tonight may be nothing more than the echoes of those desperate tongues rasping against rock. But starvation and thirst were merciful compared to other designs. There were devices meant not only to harm, but to mock. Masks of shame, iron cages placed upon the head, their grotesque designs turning men and women into beasts, pigs, donkeys, demons. Prisoners forced to wear them were paraded even in the dark of dungeons, humiliated before fellow captives. The mask did not kill, but it carved into the soul a wound that did not heal. And then there were the insects. Few records describe them in detail, because who would wish to record such horrors? Prisoners stripped and smeared with honey, left where rats, flies, meat. Each bite was small, each sting survivable. But hours became days, and the body became a feast. Such punishments lingered longer in memory than even the axe, for the axe was merciful. This dungeon, this place of whispers, was not confined to one castle or one kingdom. Across Europe, across centuries, the design was always the same: stone, darkness, silence broken only by suffering. Each ruler, each judge, each executioner added their own inventions, but all shared the same desire: to make punishment worse than death. Walk further with me down the corridor. Notice the iron door on your left. Its hinges are rusted, but it once swung wide to admit the condemned. Inside, the floor slopes downward into a pit. They called it the pit prison. Here, prisoners were lowered, sometimes naked, into a space too small to stand. The floor was covered in filth, the stench enough to choke, and still, men and women survived there, for survival was the point. Death would have been an escape, but survival meant more days, more nights, more whispers to add to the walls. And listen carefully. Do you hear it? The dungeon remembers. Every scream, every plea, every whisper lives on in the stones. Even when the torturers left, even when centuries passed and the castles above crumbled, the stones kept their voices. That is why, when you close your eyes tonight, you may still hear them. The faint scratching of nails, the hollow cough of a man too long starved, the sigh of a woman who no longer had the strength to cry. History rarely records their names. Kings and queens, knights and nobles, their deeds fill the chronicles. But those who suffered here left only their whispers. And yet their whispers are louder than any crown's command, because they remind us of what cruelty looks like when it is given free rein. The dungeon was the beginning, the threshold into punishment worse than death. It was where fear was born, where men and women descended not into execution, but into something far slower, something that clung to them, hour after hour, until the body became a prison for pain. And as we leave this chamber of whispers, you carry them with you. Their voices drift into your ears, soft, unending. For once you have stepped into the dungeon, you cannot leave it behind. The stones remember, and now so do you. Now, the dungeon does not end where the walls grow narrow. It stretches on, deeper, until the air changes. The whispers fade into a heavier silence, the kind that waits, heavy with anticipation. Here, in a chamber hidden beneath layers of stone, rests an object that was never meant to be seen in daylight. The torchlight catches it first, a crown. Not golden, not jewelled, but forged of iron. Its frame is jagged, cruel, each point sharpened not for beauty, but for suffering. Where kings and emperors wore crowns to declare their majesty, this crown was meant to unmake a person, to turn the head into a prison of fire and blood. They called it many names in different places. Some whispered of the crown of derision, others of the helmet of torment. But the name that lingers, the one carved into stories that drift from one century to the next, is the Iron Crown of Pain. It was reserved not for common thieves or beggars, but for those considered dangerous, heretics, rebels, voices that dared to rise against power. To silence them with death was not always enough. Death could make a martyr. Pain, however, made a warning. The design was deceptively simple. At its base, the iron ring was shaped to encircle the skull. From it rose spikes, curved inward, so that when the crown was placed upon the head, those spikes pressed against the scalp. Some dug shallowly, breaking skin. Others pierced deeper, pressing into bone. But the crown was rarely just placed. It was tightened. Screws, bolts, clasps, whatever the blacksmith had at hand, were turned until the iron closed in, and the spikes bit deeper. The victim would thrash, of course. Few could sit still as cold iron teeth carved into flesh. Blood ran down temples, across cheeks, dripping from chins. But the torturer's work was not done. For the crown was not merely an ornament of pain. It was a furnace. Once fixed tightly, torches were brought close, or braziers were prepared. The iron absorbed heat, growing hotter with each passing breath. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the crown began to burn. The skin beneath sizzled, hair caught fire, the smell of charred flesh filled the chamber. The prisoner could not remove it. Their hands, bound in chains, could only grasp at the air. The more they struggled, the deeper the spikes cut. Some crowns were designed with hollows at the tips of the spikes. Into these hollows, molten lead could be poured, searing directly into wounds already carved open. Few records survive of such acts, for scribes turned their eyes away, unwilling to capture the full breadth of what they had witnessed. But fragments remain, enough to remind us that cruelty was never satisfied with silence. The crown was not always fatal. Sometimes the torturer allowed the victim to live. Their scalp burned, their skull scarred, their mind fractured. They were paraded afterward, displayed in public, a living monument to fear. Heads swaddled in bandages, eyes clouded with agony, they stumbled through marketplaces as crowds looked on. Some spat, some cheered. Others, quieter, turned their eyes away, for they knew what it meant. Power had spoken, and power demanded obedience. But when death did come, it came slowly. The heat caused swelling, pressure building inside the skull. Victims screamed until their throats broke, until only guttural gasps remained. Some clawed at their own faces in madness, nails tearing skin as though they could dig the pain out with their own hands. Their whispers did not linger like those of the dungeon. They rose in shrieks, echoing through stone corridors, searing themselves into memory. The crown's cruelty was not only physical, it was symbolic. To place a crown upon the head was to grant honour. To place this crown was to strip honour away, to mock the very idea of dignity. The prisoner became a parody of royalty, a king of suffering, a queen of torment. Where true crowns carried jewels that glistened in candlelight, this one carried blood that dripped in steady rhythm. It was a theatre, always. Nobles gathered to watch. Priests came to see heretics humbled. Merchants whispered in the crowd, their voices mixing awe and fear. The victim, centre stage, wore the crown not by choice, but by decree. And those who watched learned a lesson not from the words of rulers, but from the sight of iron searing flesh. Obedience was survival. Defiance was fire. There are accounts of one such scene in Spain during the fever of the Inquisition. A man accused of blasphemy was bound to a chair, the crown fixed upon his head. He refused to confess, refused to beg for mercy. The inquisitors, angered by his silence, ordered the crown heated. As smoke rose and his face contorted, still he did not speak. They tightened the screws until blood ran into his eyes. Even then, silence. At last he collapsed, his body still, his head slumped. The crowd that gathered to watch did not cheer. They left in silence, haunted by what they had seen. For cruelty, when taken to such heights, silences even those who once demanded it. And yet, the crown did not vanish with time. Variations appeared elsewhere. In Italy, iron masks pressed against faces, heated until skin fused to metal. In France, helmets locked shut, filled with smoke from burning straw, suffocating slowly. In Germany, reports speak of spiked collars that bit into throats, tightening with each movement. Each device a relative of the Iron Crown, each designed to remind the body that its own head could become a furnace of agony. Perhaps the most haunting detail is how ordinary the crown appears once cooled. Stripped of blood, wiped of soot, it is simply iron, twisted and sharp. To see it sitting upon a table is to see nothing more than a circle of metal. Only when it touches flesh does it transform, becoming something that exists not in silence, but in screams. The room grows colder as you study it. Perhaps it is the memory that chills you. Perhaps it is the knowledge that human hands made this, forged it not for war, not for survival, but purely for suffering, blacksmiths once hammered iron into ploughs to feed villages. The same fire that made swords to defend borders made this crown, made to burn a human head from the inside out. What lingers longest is not the sight of the crown, but the smell. Imagine it, the acrid stench of singed hair, the heavier weight of roasted flesh. That smell clung to the chamber long after the prisoner had gone. Guards carried it back on their clothes. Torturers wore it like a second skin. Even centuries later, when castles fell to ruin and dungeons crumbled, those who entered claimed they could still catch the faint trace of smoke in the stones. The Iron Crown of Pain was not always remembered in chronicles. Kings wrote of battles, victories, treaties. Clerks copied laws, charters, prayers. But in the margins, sometimes faint, sometimes blurred, the crown appears. A whispered note, a warning, a mark of shame that rulers tried to bury but could never quite erase. And here, in this chamber, it remains. The whispers from the dungeon have followed you, but they are different now. They no longer plead. They hiss. They remind you that cruelty, once unleashed, finds new shapes, new tools. What began as chains and oubliettes now becomes iron forged into a parody of royalty. Where once prisoners sat in darkness, now they sit in fire. The crown rests in the torchlight, waiting. Its spikes glisten as though freshly oiled. The ring seems too small, as though it hungers to close around a skull. It does not move, and yet it feels alive. Perhaps that is the curse of such objects. They are born of intention, and intention never dies. Step closer, and you can almost hear it, faint, like metal groaning. It does not whisper words, but it speaks all the same. It tells you of the heads it has embraced, of the skin it has tasted, of the madness it has kindled. It reminds you that pain is not always a moment. Sometimes pain is a crown, worn until the world itself dissolves in fire. And so, the dungeon leads you deeper, into places where stone remembers screams and iron remembers blood. The journey has only begun, and the crown is only one throne in this kingdom of torment. The chamber of the Iron Crown fades behind you, but the stones do not let you go easily. They echo with heat, carrying the ghost of smouldering flesh long after the flame has gone. The corridor stretches forward, darker still, the torch sputtering against a draught that seems to breathe from somewhere ahead. The air grows heavier, as though the dungeon itself knows you are approaching something greater, something older, something that has crushed men, not just in body, but in memory. The passage opens into a vast hall, larger than the chambers before. The ceiling arches high above, vanishing into shadow, and in the centre stands a wheel. Not the simple wheel of a cart, nor the wheel that turns in a mill to grind wheat. This is a wheel taller than a man, broad and heavy, its spokes thick, its rim rimmed with iron. A wheel not meant to carry, but to destroy. This was once the terror of Europe, feared in villages, whispered of in marketplaces, prayed against in chapels. It had no throne, no altar, no crown. Yet for centuries it held a power greater than kings. For when flesh met the wheel, there was no return. The condemned would be brought into public squares, tied and dragged before the waiting crowd. A priest might offer words of repentance, but the wheel spoke a language far older than prayers. It was a ritual, an execution that was not an execution, a performance where death was delayed for as long as the human body could endure. The prisoner was laid out, stretched across the ground, or bound upon a wooden platform. The executioner approached, carrying an iron bar, thick, heavy, blunt. Not a blade, for a blade was swift. This tool was meant for breaking. One by one, limb by limb, the bar fell, arms shattered, legs splintered, bones crushed beneath the weight. The crowd did not turn away, for they came to see suffering stretched thin across time. And then, with the body broken but still alive, the victim was lifted, twisted, threaded into the spokes of the great wheel. Their mangled arms and legs wound through its structure, their chest bent across its rim. The wheel became both cage and display, raising the condemned high above the earth, visible to all. Some were placed upright, the wheel turned vertical like a monument. Others were laid flat, horizontal, the broken body stretched across like a sacrifice. In either form, the message was the same. Here lies rebellion crushed. Here lies sin unmasked. Here lies the fate of those who stray. The wheel did not kill quickly. That was its cruelty. Bones shattered could still hold life. Flesh torn could still breathe. The body twisted among its spokes might linger for hours, even days. Birds circled above, swooping down when hunger overtook them. Dogs prowled beneath, waiting for scraps of falling flesh. The sun burned the exposed skin. The rain chilled the broken body. The wind dried cracked lips into silence. And the crowd, the crowd, watched. Some cheered, some jeered, some crossed themselves, muttering prayers beneath their breath. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, forced to look upon the wheel as a lesson carved in bone. And above it all, the victim whispered, groaned or screamed, sounds carried by the wheel's great frame, echoing through the square like a grim song. There were variations, of course. In Germany, it became known as the Radern, to be wheeled. In France, they called it the breaking wheel. Some places gave mercy, a final blow to the chest, the coup de grace, delivered once the suffering had been sufficient. But mercy was not guaranteed. More often, the body was left to expire on its own, the wheel holding it aloft as hours stretched into days. Imagine the sky above, blue and indifferent. Imagine the flies gathering, black clouds thickening over open wounds. Imagine the prisoner's own breath, ragged, each gasp sharper than the last, knowing there would be no reprieve. Death lingered close, yet refused to touch. The wheel became more than punishment. It became a spectacle of authority. Townsfolk gathered not only to witness, but to remember. The sight etched itself into memory. The nobleman who betrayed his crown, the thief who defied the law, the murderer whose body bent like a broken doll upon the spokes. They became stories retold at firesides, their agony a cautionary tale whispered for generations. But cruelty has its own rhythm. The wheel was not always about justice. Sometimes it was about vengeance. Sometimes it was about fear. The executioner, wielding his iron bar, could choose how quickly or how slowly bones were broken. A skilled hand could prolong the ritual, shattering limbs in a pattern that kept the heart beating longer, forcing the victim to endure the wheel not as an end, but as a dwelling place. For those condemned not simply to die but to suffer, this was worse than any grave. Records tell of men left upon wheels for days, still whispering, still breathing. Villagers passed by, throwing stones, shouting curses, or simply watching as life drained away. At night, the wheel stood in silence, its silhouette stark against the moonlight. Travellers on the road would see it from afar, a dark shape with something slumped across it, and they would know, here authority had spoken. The symbolism of the wheel reached deep. In the medieval imagination, the wheel was tied to fortune, the wheel of fate, the great turning of destiny. To be placed upon the breaking wheel was not only to be punished, but to be cast down by fortune herself, lifted high only to be shattered. What better reminder for those who thought themselves untouchable? Nobles, knights, rebels, none were safe. The wheel spared no rank, no station, and yet the cruelty was not always external. For some, the greatest torment was not the breaking of bones, but the waiting. Bound, broken, lifted into the air, the condemned stared out over their own village, their own home. They saw familiar faces, familiar rooftops, the fields they once walked. They were forced to watch life continue without them, children laughing, markets bustling, bells tolling in distant chapels. Life moved on, while they remained nailed to suffering. Perhaps that was the wheel's true power. It did not simply kill, it transformed the victim into a spectacle, into a living monument of pain. Even in death, the body remained. Left upon the wheel, it decayed in open air, bones bleaching white in the sun, sinew peeling away with time. Long after breath had ceased, the wheel still spoke. It told every passerby, here is what happens when flesh meets iron, when rebellion meets authority, when a body becomes a warning. The silence of the dungeon had been heavy, the heat of the crown unbearable, but here, in the presence of the wheel, cruelty becomes vast. It is no longer confined to stone walls. It is lifted into the sky, made public, made eternal. The wheel does not whisper. It proclaims. Step closer, and you can almost hear it. The creak of wood under weight, the groan of ropes binding limbs, the shudder of iron as the bar falls again and again. You can see the blood dripping onto earth, already stained by countless before. You can smell the mingling of sweat, blood, and rot, thick in the air, clinging to clothes, seeping into memory. The wheel stands still now, abandoned by time. Its wood is cracked, its iron rusted, but touch it, and it feels alive. History lingers in its grain, in the stains too deep to wash away. It remembers every body wound into its spokes, every bone it held until nothing remained but fragments. And when the wind passes through the empty square, it almost sounds like breath. Shallow, laboured, fading. The dungeon's whispers brought you here, and the crown's fire lit the path, but now the wheel looms before you, vast and unyielding. It is not the end of cruelty. It is only another shape it has taken, another face it has worn. The wheel turns, not with mercy, but with memory. And once you have seen flesh broken upon it, you understand why history records it not as death, but as something far worse. The wheel stands tall in the square, its broken shape still lingering in the mind. But cruelty has never been content with only one form. It spreads like shadow, filling every corner where fear may grow. From the high spectacle of the wheel, punishment could also sink downward, into the earth itself, where silence smothers screams, and weight turns the human body into nothing more than breath-pressed thin. The path winds away from the open air and back toward the confinement. The corridor narrows again, though this time the stones above feel lower, pressing close as if the ceiling itself leans down to listen. The torch flickers, and in the wavering light, the floor changes. No longer flat, it is uneven, scattered with loose rock and heavier slabs stacked neatly against the wall. Their edges are worn smooth, their surfaces dark with age. These are not stones for building. These are stones for burying. There is a cruelty older than iron, older even than the wheel. It is the cruelty of weight. To press the body, to trap it beneath earth and stone, to smother life slowly under pressure that builds with every breath. This was a punishment whispered in many lands, taking different forms, but always leading to the same end. The most infamous whispers come from England, where a punishment called peine forte et dure, strong and hard pain, awaited those who refused to speak. The condemned would be laid flat upon the ground, their limbs spread wide. A wooden board, rough-hewn and unyielding, was placed upon their chest. And then the stones came. At first, only a few, small, heavy enough to ache, but not to kill. They pressed against ribs, pushing air from lungs, making each breath shallower than the last. Then more stones, larger, colder, laid carefully, deliberately. With each new weight, the prisoner's chest sank deeper, bones groaning under strain. Yet death was not the goal, not yet. The goal was compliance. The silence of the prisoner, their refusal to speak, was met with the voice of stone. Each rock said, "Confess, plead, surrender," but many did not. Some endured until the board split ribs like branches, until stones cracked bone, until breath no longer came. Death crept slowly, like water rising. And when at last the chest collapsed, when the heart faltered beneath the crushing weight, the silence became eternal. One name still echoes through this history: Giles Corey, a man of Salem in the year 1692. Accused of witchcraft, he refused to enter a plea. His silence frustrated the court, and so the stones were brought. Day after day, more weight was piled upon him. Witnesses claimed he groaned only 2 words: "More weight." And so they obeyed. At last, his chest gave way, and he was buried beneath the stones, his body sinking into earth as though the punishment itself had swallowed him whole. But England and its colonies were not alone in this cruelty. Across Europe, variations appeared. In France, prisoners were sometimes entombed alive, sealed in coffins of stone, their cries muffled until they ceased. In Italy, rebels were buried beneath rubble, crushed in punishment that mirrored the ruins they left in their wake. In the East, tales speak of prisoners placed in shallow pits, stones stacked upon their bodies, until earth itself became their executioner. The stones were not always heavy. Sometimes the cruelty was in the slowness. Pebbles first, then rocks, then slabs, each one a reminder of helplessness. The prisoner felt the weight grow, inch by inch, breath by breath. The body did not simply break, it surrendered. Lungs struggled to expand, heart hammered against the cage of bone, veins swelled as blood struggled to flow. The skin flushed red, then purple, then pale. Each stage of suffocation carved itself into the face until the prisoner became unrecognizable. What makes this punishment so haunting is its silence. Unlike the wheel, there were no great cries, no public spectacle of splintering bone. The sound was muted, the dull thud of stone upon stone, the strained wheeze of breath pressed thin, the faint crack of ribs when the weight became too much. A slow, suffocating orchestra where the final note was silence. The crowd sometimes watched, yes, but often the burial beneath stones happened away from spectacle, in corners of prisons, in courtyards, in fields where the ground bore no witness but the wind. And yet the memory lingered. People spoke of the way a man's chest sank with each new weight, the way eyes bulged as veins swelled, the way silence seemed to grow thicker as the stones piled higher. There is a cruelty in burying someone alive, but there is another cruelty in burying them piece by piece, not with earth, but with weight. Stones do not rush. They wait. They press. They turn the body into a battlefield where the enemy is gravity itself, and gravity never loses. The torchlight flickers across one of the slabs resting near the wall. Its edge is dark with what might once have been blood. Perhaps it pressed against the chest here, in this very chamber. Perhaps it cracked ribs that no one remembers now. The stones do not speak, but they remember. Their weight carries memory deeper than words. Some chronicles claim the punishment was meant to be merciful. A refusal to plead in court could stall justice, leave trials incomplete. Stones solved the silence, forcing the prisoner's choice, confess or be crushed. Yet mercy has no place in such weight. Even when death was swift, the moments before it stretched long, unbearable. And when it was slow, it was worse than the grave itself. Imagine the prisoner's thoughts as the stones rose higher. At first, defiance. I will not speak. Then discomfort. I can endure this. Then panic, when breath grows shallow, when chest refuses to rise. Then despair, when the body betrays, when the will to survive begs for mercy the mouth cannot give. At last, only silence remains, and the stones stand taller, a monument to cruelty disguised as law. But not all were buried in silence. Some were entombed beneath stones in public squares, their suffering meant as a warning. Townsfolk passed by, hearing muffled cries beneath the growing pile. Children were told, "Remember this sound, for this is what awaits those who defy." The punishment became not only pain for the condemned, but memory for the living. And sometimes the stones remained long after death. The pile became a cairn, a grave built not with love, but with cruelty. Passers-by might add their own rock, not in mourning, but in condemnation, until the mound grew higher, the body deeper, the earth itself claiming what cruelty began. The air in the chamber thickens as you stand among these stones. The weight is not upon your chest, yet it feels as though it presses upon you all the same. The silence is heavy as here, the whispers muffled, buried beneath layers of earth and memory. Even your breath feels shorter, your chest tighter, as though the stones remember what they have done and demand you feel it too. Cruelty takes many forms: iron that burns, wheels that break, dungeons that starve. But weight is different. Weight does not cut or tear. Weight waits. It presses until the body collapses, not from sharpness, but from inevitability. The earth itself becomes executioner, and there is no defiance against stone. Look closely at the slabs stacked neatly, their order precise, their surfaces smooth from use. They are not tools of war, not weapons forged in fire. They are simply stone, the most ordinary material in the world. And yet, in the hands of cruelty, even stone becomes a punishment worse than death. The corridor beyond beckons, though heavier now, as though each step carries the weight of unseen stones. The whispers are quieter here, smothered beneath earth, but they are not gone. They linger, faint, reminding you that to be buried beneath the stones was not only to die, it was to sink into silence so complete, the world itself seemed to press down and erase you. And as you step forward, you carry that silence with you. The stones do not speak, yet their weight lingers. It presses not on the chest, but on the mind. A reminder that cruelty does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers only through pressure, until the body and the will within it crumbles into nothing, The stones linger in memory long after the chamber is left behind. Their silence presses on the air, even as the corridor stretches onward into new darkness. Yet cruelty does not always come with the crush of stone or the snap of bone. Sometimes it works slowly, invisibly, not through weight, but through absence. It begins with the smallest of sensations, the hollow ache in the belly, the faint gnawing that grows sharper with each passing hour. Hunger is a whisper at first, nothing more. But given time, it becomes a roar. And when it is not by accident, but by design, when it is wielded as punishment, it becomes a torment worse than chains or flames. The passage narrows again, and here all the walls are bare. No racks, no wheels, no piles of stone, only emptiness. The silence carries a new sound now, the faint scrape of rats in the dark, the echo of a drip from above, the restless shuffle of feet that are no longer steady. This is not the silence of crushing weight. It is the silence of hunger. Throughout history, rulers and jailers alike found starvation to be a patient executioner. Unlike fire or blade, it required no effort, no spectacle. All it needed was denial, of bread, of water, of the smallest morsel of relief. A prisoner was placed in darkness, and the world simply withheld what the body could not survive without. The torment began almost kindly. On the first day, there was still strength, still hope. The stomach growled, yes, but the body drew upon its stores, burning what little reserve it had. By the second day, the gnawing grew sharper, the belly tight, the mouth dry. Thoughts of food crept into every corner, until even the memory of bread seemed like salvation. But as the days passed, hunger became something more than an ache. It was a devouring force. Muscles weakened, eyes sank, skin clung to bone. Every movement cost more than it gave. The prisoner could feel the body consuming itself, each day burning away not only fat but muscle, even the strength of the heart. At last, the prisoner lay still, unable to rise, unable even to cry. Hunger had hollowed them out, leaving only a husk. In Italy, there was a word for this, the muratoire, the wall. To be walled in was to be sealed within a chamber, denied food, denied water, left to linger until the body consumed itself. Stone did not press upon the chest as in other punishments. Here the stones formed a cage, and hunger did the rest. Some walls were built in cathedrals, where heretics or nuns accused of sin were bricked alive into narrow cells. Passers-by might hear faint cries for days, even weeks before silence at last fell. Elsewhere, starvation was not silent at all. In the Tower of London, records tell of prisoners wasting away over months, each day weaker than the last, their keepers watching as strength faded to nothing. In German lands, dungeons known as hunger towers stood tall, their prisoners locked high above the city, denied sustenance until life slipped quietly from them. What makes this punishment so chilling is its patience. The wheel was quick in comparison, the fire merciful in its swiftness. But hunger lingers. Hunger draws out suffering, stretches hours into eternities. The prisoner does not simply die. They are peeled away piece by piece, first of flesh, then of mind, until even thought itself is starved. In monasteries, starvation took on another shape. Monks who defied their vows, who rebelled against their order, were sometimes punished not with lash or exile, but with slow denial. Bread was withheld, water rationed to drops. The monk might be left in solitude with nothing but scripture and the growing pain of emptiness. Some turned their hunger inward, convincing themselves that suffering was holy. Others wasted away in despair, their faith collapsing alongside their strength. And in more cruel corners of history, starvation was used not only to punish the condemned, but to silence the unwanted. Children deemed illegitimate, widows without wealth, beggars who burdened their towns, some were cast into hunger pits, where the body slowly betrayed them. The punishment required no sword, no executioner's hand. It required only neglect made deliberate. The hunger itself carried its own horrors. At first, the prisoner dreamed of food, bread, meat, fruit ripe with juice. Then came hallucinations, visions of feasts where none existed. The body's torment twisted the mind, turning imagination against itself. By the end, even these illusions faded. There was only the slow, dull ache of a body that no longer had strength to dream. The rats thrived in such places. They fed upon what little scraps remained, sometimes gnawing at the dying themselves. There are whispers of prisoners so desperate that they turned to the rats for food, clawing in the dark for a meal that was both grotesque and forbidden. Hunger erases the boundary between human and beast, and in the hunger chambers of history, that boundary was crossed often. One tale from the Italian Inquisition tells of a woman bricked into a narrow cell for heresy. At first, she cried, her voice carrying through the stones, but as days passed, her voice weakened, fading to hoarse whispers, then silence. When at last the cell was opened, years later, her bones were found pressed against the wall, her skeleton curled into the smallest space possible, as though she had folded in upon herself, shrinking to nothing. Hunger does not strike like lightning. It creeps like shadow. The first weakness is hardly noticed, the first dizziness brushed away, but it grows, and because it grows so slowly, it becomes unbearable in a way sudden violence never can. Every moment stretches, every ache deepens, every breath feels like theft from a body that can no longer afford it. Imagine lying in the dark, belly hollow, mouth dry, waiting. At first, time drags. Hours pass like days. Then days pass like weeks. And soon, time itself dissolves. The prisoner no longer knows if it is morning or night. Only that hunger gnaws without end. At last, even the ache fades. There is only weakness, a slow sinking into silence. Yet not all deaths by hunger were silent. In some cities, the starving were displayed in cages, their wasting bodies made into warnings. Crowds passed by, watching as ribs emerged, as skin clung tight, as eyes grew wild with desperation. Their agony became a spectacle, a cruel reminder of what disobedience could bring. Children stared wide-eyed, mothers turned away, but all remembered. The torch flickers again as the passage opens into a chamber darker than the rest. Here the air is dry, and the ground is scattered with brittle shapes. Bones lie curled against walls, spines bent, skulls tilted upward as though searching for something that never came. These are not the remains of those crushed or burned. These are the remains of those who waited. The bones themselves seem lighter, more fragile, as though hunger hollowed them even after death. Among them, a clay bowl sits overturned. It is empty, cracked, its surface dry. Perhaps once it held water. Perhaps once it was placed within reach to mock the condemned, always empty, always promising what would never arrive. Its silence speaks louder than screams. The cruelty of hunger is not that it kills, but that it does so by inches. It steals slowly, leaving its victim to linger in torment, to feel life draining, not in a rush, but in a trickle. It is a punishment that does not end until the body itself gives up, until nothing remains but bone and silence. And so the hunger that never ends lingers still, not in the belly, but in the mind, the thought of emptiness, of waiting, of being consumed by one's own body. That is the torment that history leaves behind. The stones crushed from without. Hunger devours from within. Both leave silence. But hunger's silence is longer, deeper, heavier, as though it continues even after death. The corridor beckons onward, though steps feel slower here. Perhaps it is the weight of the bones scattered at your feet, or perhaps it is something else. The memory of what it is to starve, to be left empty in the dark, forgotten by the world. The air tastes dry, the silence thicker than before. Hunger has no sound, yet it echoes louder than any scream. And as you pass into the next shadow, the hollow ache follows, as though the punishment itself has lingered within you. The corridors twist deeper, and the emptiness of hunger lingers in the air like a ghost that refuses to fade. Yet the darkness soon carries a new scent. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Smoke. It clings to the stone walls, woven into them as though centuries of fire have kissed their surface and left behind a memory that will never be erased. Hunger kills in silence, but fire sings. It roars, it crackles, it consumes with a voice that cannot be ignored. And in the long history of punishment, fire was not simply destruction. It was theatre. It was belief and fear made visible, reaching toward the heavens in sparks and smoke. To be condemned to the pyre was to be transformed into both warning and offering. The body ceased to be flesh alone. It became fuel. And as flames devoured, onlookers were forced to watch, to breathe in the bitter scent of burning skin, to hear the cries that grew shrill and broke apart. Fire as punishment is older than almost any record. In ancient times, rebels, slaves, and enemies of kings were cast into flames. In Rome, the early Christians were burned alive in amphitheatres, their deaths made into spectacle for cheering crowds. The fire did not need to kill quickly. It was meant to terrify, to remind all who watched that disobedience would be answered with smoke and ash. But nowhere did the pyre find such infamy as in the age of heresy. In towns across Europe, fields became theatres of fire, where men and women accused of defying the church were bound to wooden stakes. Their crimes varied. Some denied doctrine, some sought hidden knowledge, some simply stood in the way of power. Yet their fates became the same. Rope against wrists, wood stacked high, and a crowd gathered to witness the flames. The preparation itself was cruel. The condemned were often paraded through the streets, forced to walk past their neighbours, their family, their children. They were led to the stake, where wood awaited, dry bundles, tar-soaked logs, kindling piled high. Some were tied upright, others chained so tightly that skin bruised beneath iron. A few were even smeared with pitch to make their burning swifter, as though mercy could be disguised in cruelty. When the fire was lit, it began gently. Smoke curled upward first, stinging eyes, choking breath. Then flames licked at the feet, rising slowly, teasing the condemned with searing pain before racing higher. Clothes caught, hair burned, skin blistered. The body writhed against bonds, muscles jerking in panic as heat consumed them. Some screamed, voices carrying across the crowd. Others prayed until words dissolved into shrieks. A few fell silent, whether by smoke or by sheer collapse. The crowd, for all its horror, could not look away. Fire fascinated even as it terrified. Children clutched their mothers. Men crossed themselves. Women wept. And yet all stayed, for this was a ritual as much as a punishment. It was meant to burn itself into memory, so that fear would linger long after the embers cooled. One cannot speak of the pyre without whispering of Joan of Arc, a girl who led armies, who heard voices she claimed divine, who defied the structures that sought to control her. In 1431, she was tied to the stake in Rouen, the wood stacked high, the crowd vast. When the flames rose, she cried for Christ, her voice breaking through smoke until the fire swallowed it. Witnesses swore her heart would not burn, even when the rest of her body had turned to ash. Her death became more than execution. It became legend. But Joan was not alone. Thousands upon thousands were burned across centuries. Heretics, witches, rebels, those who would not bend. Each pyre was both death and warning, punishment and spectacle, and each left behind the same thing: ashes. What fire takes, it leaves altered. Bones reduced to fragments, skin to soot, flesh to smoke. Ashes scatter on the wind, carried beyond the place of death, settling into soil, drifting into rivers, breathed in by those who watched. To burn someone alive was to erase them in body, yet spread them in fragments across the world. There is something haunting in that. The condemned did not simply die. They became part of the air, part of the earth, part of the breath of those who condemned them. The cruelty of burning was not always immediate. Some fires were lit with damp wood, chosen deliberately so that smoke would choke before flames consumed. Others were stoked slowly, logs added piece by piece, so that the condemned suffered longer. In some records, executioners tied a bag of gunpowder around the neck to hasten death when the flames reached it. But not all were granted such release. Many burned until only charred bone and twisted iron chains remained. Even after the flames died, the punishment continued. Ashes were often scattered in rivers to prevent burial, to deny even the dignity of a grave. The condemned were to have no resting place, no monument, no stone to mark where they lay. Their memory was meant to vanish like smoke. And yet, paradoxically, this very erasure ensured remembrance. For when death is made spectacle, forgetting becomes impossible. In the east of Europe, fires sometimes burn not for heresy, but for treason. Rebels were tied to stakes in city squares, their cries rising with the smoke. The flames licked not only at their flesh, but at the memory of their rebellion, consuming body and symbol together. The ashes of the pyre became a warning etched in the minds of all who lived on. In Germany, witches were gathered in groups, bound together, and burned in great pyres that lit the night sky. Some were strangled first, their bodies then cast into the flames. Others were burned alive, their cries mingling until they became indistinguishable, one great chorus of pain rising to heaven. These fires were not only punishments, they were rituals meant to purge fear through spectacle. Yet all they truly left behind was silence and smoke. The chamber you now stand in smells faintly of that same smoke, though no flames burn here. The walls are darkened, scorched black by fires long since extinguished. On the floor, small piles of grey dust lie undisturbed, gathered in corners like remnants of memory. The air tastes dry, bitter, carrying the faint tang of ash. It is said that in some places, when the fire burned out, the ashes were mixed with earth and scattered on roads, so that all who walked there trampled upon the remains of the condemned. Others whispered that the wind carried the ashes into fields, that crops grew upon them, that bread was baked from wheat nourished by the dead. Whether truth or not, the thought lingers. The condemned, denied a grave, instead became part of the living world, consumed in another way. There is no silence quite like that which follows a fire. The roar fades, the crackle dies, the smoke thins, and what remains is emptiness. Charred wood, blackened stakes, the faint smell that clings for days, weeks, years. The pyre kills loudly, but its aftermath is quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses into memory and stays there, heavy as stone. And so the ashes of the pyre remain, even centuries later. Not in the wood, not in the bone, but in the stories carried forward, in the whispers of what it means to be consumed, not only in body, but in memory. Fire may erase flesh, but it leaves behind shadow. And the shadow of the pyre stretches long, reaching even now, lingering in the air you breathe. The corridor extends beyond the scorched walls, and though no flame burns here, the air still feels warm, heavy with the weight of what once was. Each step carries the faint echo of crackling wood, of cries breaking into smoke, of silence that follows when fire has nothing left to consume. And so you walk on, carrying that silence with you, as though the ashes have settled not on the floor, but in your very breath. The air still tastes faintly of ash. It clings to the back of the throat, dry, bitter, as though the pyre has followed you deeper into the stone halls. But smoke fades. Fire consumes and leaves nothing but emptiness. The corridor ahead leads into something colder, something more enduring than flame. For while fire reduces the body to ash in moments, there were punishments meant to peel it apart slowly, layer by layer, leaving behind not dust, but memory carved in flesh. The torchlight flickers over walls marked with faint scratches, as though nails dragged against stone. And in that dim light, one truth settles heavy. The skin that shields the body has never been invulnerable. It is the first thing the world sees, the boundary between inside and out. And when cruelty seeks to destroy not only the body, but the person within it, there is no torment more direct than to strip that shield away. To be flayed alive was to endure a punishment older than kingdoms. The Assyrians, fierce in conquest, were said to strip the skin from rebels, nailing it to city walls as a warning. In their hands, the act was not simply death, it was message. The skin of the condemned became a flag of obedience, stretched in the sun, a silent reminder of what defiance brought. Later in the kingdoms of Europe and the East, flaying became both punishment and spectacle. The condemned was bound, spread across a board or stake. Knives were drawn, not to stab, not to cut deep, but to slice carefully along the surface, separating flesh from skin. The executioner worked slowly, methodically, peeling strips away as the victim writhed. The agony was not only in the nerves, though each slice set them aflame. It was in the exposure, the revelation of what was never meant to be seen. Skin, once gone, left the body raw, blood weeping from every surface. The prisoner often remained alive long into the ordeal, each breath sending new waves of torment through nerves that screamed without end. Some collapsed quickly, fainting into merciful darkness, but others endured, forced to witness their own undoing. The most infamous story comes from England in the 13th century, when Hugh Despenser, a hated advisor to Edward II, fell into the hands of his enemies. His execution was drawn out with careful cruelty. Stripped naked, he was hung, cut and disemboweled, but before death claimed him, his skin was peeled from his body in long, deliberate strokes. Chroniclers whispered that pieces of it were displayed as trophies, as though hatred could not be satisfied with death alone. And in France, records tell of the punishment reserved for regicides, those who dared kill a king. François Ravaillac, who murdered Henry IV in 1610, was not only drawn and quartered, but also flayed. His flesh was torn by pincers, his skin peeled away before the final act. The crowd watched, horrified, yet compelled, as the executioners made of his body a lesson written in agony. Flaying was not always carried out to the end. Sometimes it was used as partial torment, hands stripped, feet peeled, faces cut bare, to mark the condemned forever, even if they lived. A man without skin on his hands could never work again. A face flayed of its shield became both punishment and warning, forcing the condemned to carry their torment visibly, until death finally came. The horror lies not only in the pain, but in what it means. To strip a person of their skin is to strip them of identity. It is to erase the mask that faces the world, to lay bare what was never meant to be exposed. Flesh raw and glistening, veins visible, muscles quivering. It is humanity undone, displayed as fragility. The punishment was not simply to hurt, it was to unmake. The chamber ahead opens wider, and on the wall hangs something that might once have been leather, though its shape is strangely human. It stretches thin, brittle with age, its surface cracked. Whether relic or warning, it speaks without words. Once, perhaps, it covered a man. Now it hangs silent, emptied of life, but not of memory. In some cultures, skin was preserved deliberately. The flayed remains of rebels were displayed upon gates, draped across walls, nailed to doors, as though their absence from the body was not enough. Their presence had to haunt the living as well. Even after the condemned was gone, their skin lingered, an eternal witness. The Aztecs, too, carried rituals of flaying, though in their hands it was not punishment, but offering. In ceremonies to Saipe Totec, the flayed lord, victims were skinned, their hides worn by priests who walked among the people as embodiments of rebirth. Yet even in ritual, the act carried the same horror. The skin that would not stay became a mask for another, life taken so life might continue. The line between devotion and torment blurred until both looked the same. To be skinned alive was agony, but its true cruelty was endurance. Unlike the wheel, which broke quickly, or the pyre, which consumed with speed, flaying could last for hours. The executioner's knife traced carefully, ensuring the condemned lived long enough to feel every cut. The body resisted, yes. Shock threatened, blood loss beckoned, but still, with precision, life was prolonged. Imagine the sensation. The first slice burning sharper than flame, nerves screaming as they are exposed to air. The pull of skin as it tears away. The strange emptiness of being unbound from what once was part of you. The body thrashing, bound, yet still trembling beneath the knife. The eyes staring, wide pleading, yet unable to close against the horror of watching one's own unraveling. And when at last the end came, it was often not merciful. Death arrived through blood loss, through shock, through collapse, but never swiftly enough. The skin was gone, and the body, once shielded, lay raw. What had once been human became something else, something between life and death, identity and erasure. The crowd did not forget such sights. Where ashes scattered and smoke faded, the memory of flaying lingered sharper, etched into minds with the clarity of horror. People whispered of it for generations, each retelling carrying the same chill. The skin that would not stay, the body unmasked, the humanity stripped away until nothing remained but blood and fear. Even the condemned themselves became legend. The Assyrian rebels, Hugh Despenser, Ravaillac, each remembered not simply for who they were, but for how they were unmade. The punishment did not vanish with death. It lingered, as enduring as the scars left upon walls where skin once hung. The torchlight in the chamber flickers low, casting long shadows across the brittle relic upon the wall. The air feels colder here, though no wind stirs. Perhaps it is the thought of exposure, of standing without shield, of being peeled until nothing remains. Perhaps it is memory itself, lingering heavier than stone. Skin is what binds us, what holds us together, what faces the world each day. To lose it is to lose not only life, but self. And in history's cruel hands, there was no torment more direct, more intimate than to strip it away. The silence that follows carries a weight unlike any other. Not the silence of stones, not the emptiness of hunger, not the fading of ash. It is the silence of absence, of something gone that should have remained. A silence that clings, tighter than smoke, heavier than fire. The corridor stretches onward, deeper still, as though cruelty itself has no end. And as you move forward, you carry with you not only the scent of ash, but the shadow of skin that would not stay, memories stretched thin, brittle, hanging in the dark. A reminder that even the body's shield could be taken, leaving only raw silence beneath. The corridors turn damp, the stone walls glisten faintly, as though weeping with condensation, and the air grows heavier, thicker, carrying with it the faint brine of salt. Somewhere beyond the darkness, water breathes, lapping against unseen walls, steady and endless. It is here that another form of cruelty lingers, one that does not burn, does not cut, does not break bones in spectacle, but instead drags the condemned into silence, into depths that swallow screams whole. To be bound to the sea was to be given over to a punishment at once simple and absolute. No executioner's hand needed to guide a blade. No torch was required to light the pyre. The elements themselves became the agents of death. Shackles closed around wrists and ankles, heavy iron links designed not merely to bind but to weigh down. Once set in place, they left no room for struggle, no chance for breath. The condemned were led to the edge of docks, or carried in small boats to deeper waters. Some were pushed, others dropped, some simply rolled overboard, their bodies disappearing with barely a splash. The sea does not fight, it receives. And once it closes, the water holds, drawing its captive downward into pressure, darkness, and silence. It is said that the Venetians, those merchants of the lagoon, dealt with traitors in this way. Accused men would be bound in sacks weighted with stones, their bodies heaved into the canals at night. No spectacle here, no audience of thousands, just a quiet, methodical disposal into the black water, where no one could witness the final moments. In the morning, the canal would appear serene again, only the faintest ripple hinting at what had sunk beneath. The Romans, too, practiced such a form of execution. Parricides, those who murdered their parents, were thought so unnatural in crime that ordinary punishment would not suffice. Instead, they were sealed in a leather sack alongside a rooster, a dog, a viper, and a monkey. Weighted, the sack was cast into a river, where man and beasts drowned together in violent confusion. The logic was not only to kill but to strip away dignity, to condemn the guilty to die in chaos, sealed away from the world in a watery grave. And then there were the sailors. Life at sea was governed by harsh discipline, for on the waves rebellion could sink not just authority, but the entire crew, mutineers, thieves, and those who challenged captains often met their fate not with sword, but with water. A body bound with chain, hurled overboard, vanished almost instantly, the ocean ensuring it would never return. To be left floating was dangerous, for the sea had its own sense of shame, corpses washing back to shore, reminders of justice served, reminders unwanted. But with shackles there was no return, only depth. The cruelty of drowning is not in its speed, it is in the seconds stretched impossibly long. The body resists, thrashing, lungs screaming for air. At first the reflex is to hold breath, muscles straining, chest burning as the need for oxygen grows unbearable. Panic overtakes reason, and the mouth opens despite every instinct to resist. Water rushes in, cold and alien, filling the lungs where air should be. The body convulses, desperate, choking. Sight blurs, sound distorts into muffled emptiness. And then comes the stillness. the world fades into blackness, the burning replaced with quiet as consciousness slips away. But it is never quick enough. Those who watched knew it, could see the limbs flailing, the slow weakening as iron pulled the condemned deeper into the unseen. Some said the sea held its victims for days before letting go, their bodies washing ashore pale and bloated, shackles still clinging like grim jewellery. In the east, similar punishments emerged. Chinese records describe criminals drowned in rivers, bound so that escape was impossible. In Japan, during certain periods, rebels were executed by being placed in bamboo cages, dragged offshore and left to sink. The sea became both tomb and eraser, swallowing not just the body, but the memory of defiance. Yet even the silence of water did not prevent cruelty from shaping spectacle. There were times when drowning was made public, prisoners lowered slowly into rivers before crowds, chains ensuring they could not rise. The audience would watch the struggle, the desperate fight against what could not be fought, until the body finally stilled. It was not the violence of flames or the tearing of knives, but it was no less haunting. The absence of sound, the absence of cries, was a spectacle in itself. What makes this punishment endure in memory is its helplessness. Against fire, one might scream. Against the wheel, bones might resist until they broke. Against knives, one might thrash and spit. But against water there is nothing. No wall to push against, no hand to strike, no chance to breathe. The body is consumed by what is meant to sustain life. Water, the giver, becomes the taker. The walls around you drip as though remembering. The torchlight reflects in puddles along the stone floor, their surfaces trembling faintly, as if disturbed by something below. In that flickering reflection lies the image of countless forgotten, those who vanished beneath canals, who sank beneath rivers, who never returned from the sea. Some of them, perhaps, were innocent, others guilty. But punishment beneath the sea erases distinction. There is no body to display, no grave to mark, only whispers that someone was taken, weighted and drowned. The cruelty lies not only in the death, but in the disappearance. Families left without closure, names erased with the tide, memory itself drowned alongside flesh. The sea does not remember individually. It keeps no ledger of names, no record of faces. It simply holds what is given, pressing it into its depths until all is one. Yet people remembered nonetheless. Legends grew of drowned men whose chains rattled beneath the waves, of ghosts surfacing on foggy nights, their hands still bound, their eyes wide with the terror of their last breath. Fishermen swore of nets catching more than fish, iron and bone rising together from the deep. Drowning was sometimes seen as merciful compared to other punishments, swifter than flaying, less brutal than burning. But its mercy was deceptive. Shackles turned the sea into an endless coffin, and the thought of sinking alive into black silence haunted even the hardest hearts. Perhaps this was why rulers chose it, not merely for its efficiency, but for the lingering dread it inspired. The Venetians whispered of traitors thrown into the waters near the Bridge of Sighs, where prisoners walked their last steps before being carried into the dark. The bridge's name, some said, came not from lovers' sighs, but from condemned men drawing one final breath of daylight before being dragged beneath. Whether truth or invention, the story endures. Carried like ripples through history's waters, the chamber grows colder, and the sound of dripping becomes steady, rhythmic, like the faint echo of waves. Here, shackles hang from the wall, their iron rusted links stiff, each one heavy enough to drag a man under without effort. They are relics of a punishment that needed no fire, no rope, no spectacle, only weight, water, and silence. It is silence, perhaps, that makes this punishment feel worse than death alone. The silence of lungs filling, of screams swallowed, of chains sinking deeper until no sound remains at all. Silence not only of body, but of memory, of the world forgetting who once was there. And to be shackled beneath the sea was to be condemned twice, once by the water, once by history itself. The corridor narrows again, leading away from the damp air, the sound of dripping. Yet the weight of it follows, as those shackles still cling to the ankles, pulling each step heavier, slower. And though the sea is far behind, its silence lingers, echoing in thought, the silence of those who sank, never to rise again. The air grows still again. The sound of dripping water fades behind, and the passage opens into a chamber where the walls are not slick with damp, but scarred, gouged with deep lines, as though knives had been drawn across the stone itself. These grooves catch the torchlight, shadows filling them like black wounds that never heal. In a place such as this, punishment did not drown. It did not burn. It cut. And it cut with a purpose, not merely to end, but to erase the very voice of its victim. Where the sea swallowed screams, here silence was crafted deliberately. A silence not of absence, but of mutilation. This was the fate of those whose tongues spoke treason, blasphemy, or defiance. To carve into flesh was not just to punish, it was to command obedience by silencing those who dared to speak. The act began with binding. Prisoners were forced down, jaws pried open, sometimes by iron clamps, sometimes by the brutal strength of hands. A sharp blade, small enough to maneuver, long enough to reach deep, was driven into the mouth, severing the tongue at its root. The cut was swift but never clean. The victim thrashed, choking on their own blood, gurgling as speech collapsed into wet, animal sounds. The silence came not instantly, but through agony, as the body realized it could no longer form the words it once took for granted. Among the Byzantines, this punishment was political as much as it was physical. Rivals to emperors, captured conspirators, were not always executed outright. Death could make martyrs. Silence made forgotten men. By cutting out tongues, rulers ensured their enemies lived, but lived voiceless, stripped of the power to inspire, to command, to lead. Mutilation became a tool of governance, a reminder that a man who cannot speak cannot rule. In medieval Europe, the same cruelty emerged. Gossipers, liars, and blasphemers were marked for silence. Executioners carried heated irons shaped like tongs, red with fire, which they thrust into mouths, clamping and burning away tongues in one motion. The smell of scorched flesh filled the square, mingling with screams that turned to gurgles, until the victim collapsed, incapable of sound. The crowd was not merely watching a punishment, they were witnessing the destruction of language itself, the deliberate dismantling of voice. But tongues were not the only target. Sometimes lips were sliced, noses severed, ears cut away. Faces became warnings, skin transformed into grotesque symbols of transgression. Silence was carved not just in sound, but in appearance. A mutilated face walked the streets as a living decree: speak against power, and you will be marked forever. In Islamic Persia, rebels and heretics might find their punishment in having ears or noses cut away, leaving them disfigured but alive. The Ottomans too used mutilation to silence without killing. The body remained but altered, a living reminder of obedience enforced through pain. The cruelty of such acts was not confined to the knife. Once mutilated, the victim lived on, forced to exist in a body that betrayed them. A merchant without a tongue could not bargain. A preacher without lips could not deliver sermons. A singer with ears shorn off was mocked even in silence. The punishment lingered not in the moment of cutting, but in every day that followed. And there were darker variations still. In some places, silence was carved into bone itself, literally. Executioners would drive nails or knives beneath fingernails, into joints, or scrape patterns along skulls and shins. These mutilations carried meanings, branding the condemned with shame etched into their very skeleton. Some bones recovered, others never did. The pain was sharp, but the true cruelty lay in permanence, in carrying marks that whispered of punishment long after the flesh healed. One tale tells of a monk who dared to write against his order. His hands were broken, his fingers snapped one by one, until writing was impossible. They called it mercy, for his life was spared. But his silence was carved into bone, every movement of his hands a reminder that words had cost him freedom. This form of punishment, though varied across lands, always circled back to one principle: to remove not just sound, but identity. Voice is expression, face is presence, hands are agency. To cut, to burn, to shatter these was to destroy a person's role in society while leaving them alive. Death was final. Mutilation was endless. The torchlight shivers against the wall, catching faint marks where chains once hung. The grooves in the stone, those long scratches, are perhaps not merely the work of knives, but of nails dragged desperately by prisoners trying to cling to anything solid, while steel carved them apart. The silence in the chamber feels heavy, as though voices once filled it, shouts, cries, pleas, but have been stripped away, leaving only echoes no ear can truly hear. Silence carved into bone carries another cruelty. The victim often became an object of ridicule, not pity. The sight of a man trying to speak without a tongue, of lips fumbling uselessly, brought laughter to crowds who had grown accustomed to spectacle. Shame piled atop pain, isolation atop mutilation. Even in freedom, the condemned found themselves exiled from language itself. Imagine the cruelty of trying to form a child's name, only to produce incoherent sounds. Imagine trying to pray, only to choke on syllables that no longer exist. Imagine living with memory intact, but the ability to express it destroyed. That was the punishment, to be trapped inside one's own silence. And it was not always done for crime. Slaves across empires were sometimes silenced through mutilation to prevent rebellion. Masters, fearing the spread of defiance, carved silence into those they considered property. It was not enough to own the body, they sought to own the voice, or extinguish it entirely. In time, stories grew of the mutilated, haunting the very places they had been silenced. Travellers in Constantinople spoke of men with scarred mouths, wandering palace ruins, whispering without sound, their lips moving endlessly. In English folklore, tales spread of tongueless ghosts moaning in graveyards, mouths open wide but incapable of scream. Whether truth or invention, these stories reflected what people knew in life. Silence could be more terrifying than death. The chamber offers no noise, only the faint rasp of your own breath. In that hush, you can almost imagine the sound of a blade scraping across bone, of a tongue falling heavily to the floor, of chains rattling against stone as bodies convulsed. Silence carved into flesh and bone is not the absence of noise. It is the presence of something deeper. A void, a hollowness imposed deliberately, crafted by hands that knew pain as a tool of power. And so, while fire consumed quickly, While the wheel shattered brutally, mutilation lingered. It did not kill. It reshaped. It remade the condemned into shadows of themselves, alive yet silenced, walking embodiments of punishment. The cruelty was not in the end of life, but in forcing life to continue beneath the weight of mutilation, each breath a reminder of what had been taken. The torch flickers low. The chamber narrows once again, leading onward. Yet the silence follows, clinging like a shadow. It moves with you, pressing against your skin, whispering in the absence of sound. You feel it in your teeth, in your throat, in the brittle memory of bone. For once carved, silence does not end. It lingers, waiting to be remembered. The passage ahead widens, but the air grows fouler, heavy with the imagined stench of blood turned sour in the soil. Stone gives way to an open space, not walled like a chamber, but vast, as though the earth itself were carved out to contain what once stood here. And in that darkness, rising like shadows from the ground, you begin to see the outlines, tall, jagged poles, weathered and uneven, stretching upward like a forest without leaves. It is not a forest. It is a garden of living stakes. This punishment was not the work of quick tempers or improvisation. It was methodical, cultivated like crops, arranged for display. To impale a man upon a sharpened stake was to create not just pain but permanence, a monument of flesh and wood designed to endure. Death was certain, but it was never swift. The stake was not always driven through the chest. That would end too quickly. Instead, the sharpened wood was positioned with deliberate cruelty, entering the body in ways that prolonged life. Through the lower torso, through the abdomen, even carefully angled to avoid the heart, so that the victim lived for hours, sometimes days. Vlad of Wallachia, remembered by whispers as Dracula, mastered this art until it became synonymous with his name. His land was said to bristle with stakes, each crowned with a writhing figure, or the rotting husk of one already dead. Travellers told of fields where thousands stood impaled, the wind sighing through their swollen corpses, creating a chorus of decay. The lesson was not hidden. It was meant to be seen, meant to sear itself into memory. Witnesses described the screams as unearthly, stretched by pain beyond words. The impaled did not thrash. Movement drove the stake deeper. They shifted slowly, agonizingly, each breath a new violation. The body sagged under its own weight, sliding further down the wood as time dragged on. Eventually, the screams gave way to groans, groans to whispers, and whispers to silence. It was not merely execution, it was spectacle. Rulers who practiced impalement turned punishment into architecture, lining roads with stakes so that all who approached would walk through avenues of the condemned. Villages burned with fear long before armies arrived, the forest of death announcing power more effectively than any banner or trumpet. But this cruelty was not unique to one man. Across the Ottoman world, impalement served as a brutal warning. In the Middle East, in parts of Asia, even among ancient Assyrians, the stake was a tool for order, a way to remind people that disobedience grew no roots. Wherever wood was plentiful and fear necessary, the garden bloomed. What makes this punishment linger in memory is not only the pain, but the image. A crucifixion could fade in memory as one among many, but a stake with a body hung upon it stood like a grotesque tree, a living corpse bound to the landscape itself. It blurred the line between nature and man, turning the punished into part of the earth, upright and silent. Imagine walking through such a garden at dusk. The air heavy with the metallic tang of blood, the low moans of those not yet dead carried on the wind, the silhouettes of bodies swaying against the sky. Imagine the terror of peasants passing through, children shielded from the sight, yet hearing the cries that pierce through closed eyes. The punishment extended beyond the victim. It spread into all who saw. Accounts speak of impaled men surviving for 2 days, their bodies refusing to surrender despite the stake piercing them through. Others describe victims clawing weakly at the air, fingers twitching as if trying to grasp onto life, unable to scream as exhaustion stole their voice. To watch was to see the very definition of lingering death. In some places, the stakes were arranged with disturbing care. Symmetry mattered. Rows were straight, evenly spaced, creating what looked like cultivated fields. A macabre orderliness underscored the intent. This was not chaos. It was deliberate. A ruler demonstrating not just cruelty, but control. Each body became a warning planted like a crop to harvest obedience. The horror spread even in memory. Travellers returning from lands where impalement reigned told their tales to others, carrying fear beyond borders. The punishment became larger than life, a story that terrified even those who never saw it. This is how power grows, through fear that transcends presence, through punishments that linger not only in sight but in imagination. Some chroniclers struggled to describe what they saw, their words breaking into fragments, as if language itself recoiled. The sheer number, the stillness punctuated by faint sounds of the dying, the unnatural sight of men standing upon poles long after life should have ended. It was almost beyond recording. And perhaps that was part of its purpose, to create a vision so unbearable that memory itself became an accomplice to terror. The soil beneath this imagined garden seems to pulse, as if still rich with what was spilled into it. Stakes rise like bones of the earth, stripped of bark, smoothed only by the passage of bodies sliding down them. The torchlight bends their shadows long, so that the floor itself seems crowded, as though those impaled still stand, watching silently, their faces lost, but their presence unforgotten. It is easy to think of impalement as an act of madness, the cruelty of one man, one time, but it was no accident, no isolated frenzy. It was a punishment woven into law, wielded by kings and sultans, enforced by soldiers who carried out orders without hesitation. A garden of stakes could not exist without intent, without hands that cut the wood, sharpened it, raised it upright, and lifted bodies onto it. Punishment is never the work of one. It is a chain of many, each link complicit. What makes this cruelty worse than death itself is not simply the suffering it inflicted, but the way it lingered. A body burned left ash. A body drowned disappeared. But a body impaled remained, visible for days, weeks, until time or bird stripped it bare. Even then, the stake endured, waiting for another victim. Death ended a life. The stake marked the world. In silence, the garden still breathes. It speaks without sound, without words, its message carved into the horizon. Here is what happens when power is defied. Here is the price of rebellion, of betrayal, of standing against those who rule. It is a message that needed no voice, no inscription. The sight alone was enough. The path through this place narrows again, winding between stakes, each one catching the light as if holding shadows of those once mounted there. The smell lingers only in imagination, but imagination is enough. You cannot escape the weight of what was planted here. Human suffering grown like crops, harvested like wheat, cultivated until the soil itself could remember. And as the last of the stakes fade into the distance, the silence follows. Silence of screams swallowed by exhaustion. Silence of rows of bodies too numerous to count. Silence of a garden where the living once became monuments. silence that does not release, but clings like the shadow of wood against the dying sky. The road through the garden of stakes narrows until the wooden silhouettes vanish behind you. But darkness does not loosen its grip. It thickens instead, damp now, heavy with the suggestion of things that move unseen. The air stirs in faint draughts, not from wind, but from the scurrying of bodies too small to see until they draw close. You hear them first, claws clicking faintly on stone, tails dragging across the floor, the wet shuffle of hunger gathering rats. Few creatures in history have been more despised, more feared, yet more useful to those who wish to break the human spirit. In cities plagued by filth and famine, they swarmed in numbers that seemed impossible to control, feeding on what humans lost, growing fat on the rot of civilization. They were not simply pests, they were tools, and rulers, jailers and torturers learned long ago that the smallest teeth could carve terror deeper than any blade. Punishments built around rats were never about swiftness. They thrived on patience, on letting dread do as much damage as claws. Sometimes the condemned was bound flat, a heavy clay pot placed upon their stomach or chest, a live rat trapped inside. Heat would then be applied to the outer surface of the pot, burning coals, a torch, anything to stoke panic in the trapped creature. Driven mad by rising heat, desperate for escape, the rat would burrow downward, into the only avenue open to it, the soft flesh of the human beneath. No blade could mimic that horror. To feel an animal tearing into you, not for malice but survival, clawing and gnawing as it sought to flee. This was punishment designed not just to kill, but to unmake a person. It was not quick. The rat chewed slowly, tearing tunnels of agony through muscle, flesh and organ. The victim screamed, writhed, but could not throw the pot aside, could not escape. Death came eventually, but only after the mind had been broken, hollowed out by fear and the knowledge that the body was being consumed from within. But rats were not only used in this single, infamous way. In prisons across Europe, they were let loose in cells where the condemned awaited judgment. Hunger made them bold. They nibbled on sleeping flesh, feasted on sores, chewed at eyelids and ears. Some were starved intentionally, their food withheld so that the first thing they encountered was living human skin. Guards did not need to strike. The animals carried out torment with mechanical persistence, night after night, while the condemned lay shackled, unable to flee. And the rats always returned. That was their cruelty. Kill one, and 10 more came. Drive them off, and hunger brought them back. For some prisoners, the slow gnawing at their extremities, fingers, toes, lips, was worse than death itself. Pain could be endured when it ended, but this suffering stretched across endless nights, leaving survivors who envied those who had died more swiftly. The symbolism was as sharp as the pain. Rats were carriers of plague, of pestilence, of everything foul. To be devoured by them was to be marked as less than human, as food for vermin, stripped not only of dignity, but of the boundary between man and waste. In the eyes of the authorities, this made the punishment perfect. It degraded while it destroyed. Accounts describe cities in South America during the height of conquest, where captured rebels were lowered into pits swarming with starving rodents. Some survived, but not intact. They emerged scarred, bleeding, haunted, having felt teeth scraping against bone. Others never re-emerged, their screams fading into the squeals of feeding animals. Even the sound of rats was enough to break people. In medieval dungeons, stories circulated of prisoners kept in pitch-black chambers where rats nested. The condemned could not see what brushed against their skin, what skittered over their bodies, what gnawed at their clothes and hair in the night. They only heard the constant movement, the ceaseless whisper of small claws. Madness set in long before death arrived. And yet, for all their horror, rats were not simply instruments of cruelty. They were reminders of helplessness. Humans built walls, towers, cities, empires, but rats always found a way through. To be punished with them was to be reminded of the fragility of the body, the thinness of skin, the way civilization itself could be undone by something small, unrelenting, and patient. Imagine lying on your back, bound by rope, a clay pot resting on your chest. Inside, you hear scratching. The heat rises, the air inside the vessel grows suffocating, and the rat begins to thrash. It throws itself against the curve of the pot, searching for escape. Then you feel it, first a press of claws against your skin, then a puncture. The rat does not hesitate. It does not care about your screams, your thrashing. It only digs deeper, each movement a frantic scramble for life that ends yours. Imagine being sealed in a cell where the stone floor shifts with vermin. Their eyes glow faintly in the dark, hundreds of tiny lights reflecting your fear. You try to sleep, but sleep never comes. Instead, they creep closer, drawn by your stillness, your warmth. A sudden nip at your heel, a sharp pain at your ear, a trail of blood across your cheek. They do not kill you quickly. They carve you, bite by bite, into something unrecognizable. This was punishment that blurred the line between human cruelty and natural hunger. The torturer's genius lay not in invention, but in unleashing what was already there, weaponizing the animal world. The rats needed no instruction. They only needed access. And once they had it, they did not stop. The silence in this corridor is deceptive. You can hear faint echoes, like whispers, but they are not voices. They are the rustle of countless feet, always just beyond sight. The shadows seem to move at the edges of the torchlight, shapes darting and vanishing before the eye can settle on them. You feel watched, surrounded, not by men or spirits, but by something older, smaller, hungrier. It was never just the pain of the body that made this punishment worse than death. It was the stripping of humanity, the realization that flesh could be treated as carrion, that one's place at the top of the food chain was fragile, illusory. When the rats came, you were no different from refuse, no different from a corpse. You were simply meat. Perhaps that is why so many rulers found this method appealing. It did not just kill, it humiliated, it reduced. It turned rebellion into fodder, pride into shrieks, men into meals. And in that degradation, order was maintained. Fear spread. No one wanted to end as rat food. The path winds on, each step echoing as though on hollow stone. The scratching grows louder, nearer, though nothing can be seen. The mind fills in what the eyes cannot. Teeth glinting in the dark, whiskers trembling, bodies pressing forward in numbers too vast to stop. History has buried the screams of those who endured this fate, but the silence feels full of them still, clinging like shadows that will not leave. And the worst truth of all, unlike many punishments, this one has never fully vanished. The methods shift, the tools change, but the idea, the weaponization of vermin, of hunger, of fear too small to fight, lingers across ages. The rats remain. They always do. The scratching fades, though the unease it leaves behind lingers like a shadow you cannot shake. The path bends once more, and in the stillness ahead, there is a faint orange glow. At first it looks like torchlight spilling across stone, but the air is warmer here, thicker, as though the walls themselves remember fire. And then you see it. A chair, ordinary in shape, grotesque in design. Its frame glimmers with dull metal, the iron scorched black in places, the seat covered in tiny protrusions, spikes sharpened to catch flesh the moment it touches down. The arms and back are lined with the same cruel points, waiting patiently. It is a throne, yes, but not one made for kings. This is the chair of torment, and unlike other punishments, it demanded that its victims sit in stillness, bound into a seat that would not let go until fire had eaten everything away. The torture chair appeared in many guises across centuries, but its purpose was always the same: to turn the simplest act of rest into a slow theatre of agony. To sit was to surrender, to be claimed by iron. Prisoners were forced down onto the spikes, their weight driving points into skin. Straps and clamps bound their wrists, ankles, chest and neck, holding them upright. Once secured, escape was impossible. The more they struggled, the deeper the spikes tore, piercing muscle, drawing blood that slicked the metal until it gleamed red in the light. Yet the pain of punctured flesh was only the beginning. Beneath the chair, torturers lit fires, sometimes a slow bed of coals, sometimes roaring flames. Iron conducted heat, spreading it upward into the frame, until the seat beneath the prisoner's body grew unbearably hot. The spikes became branding irons, searing skin, cooking flesh in place. It is one thing to burn at the stake, the fire consuming quickly, smoke choking as flames rise. It is another to sit in iron while heat crawls upward inch by inch, to feel the body cook from the bottom up while still bound in position. The victim could see the fire glowing beneath them, hear the hiss as their own sweat dripped onto coals, smell the thick smoke of scorched hair and roasted skin. And there was no movement to lessen it, only stillness, enforced by straps that pulled tighter with every spasm. The horror of the chair was not in spectacle alone, but in duration. Some were kept seated for hours, the fire adjusted carefully to prolong torment without granting release. Too much heat, and death came swiftly. Too little, and the victim endured until the body slumped, fainting from pain. Executioners learned to stoke coals in rhythm, enough to burn but not enough to kill, ensuring the cries continued long into the night. Witnesses were often summoned. Crowds gathered not just to watch but to learn. For rulers, the chair was a tool of instruction. It showed what happened when law was defied, when authority was mocked. To see a man strapped into it, to smell the acrid perfume of human flesh on fire, was to carry fear home, deeper and longer lasting than any sermon could provide. Some chairs were crafted with grotesque precision. Spikes were arranged to target sensitive areas: the back, the genitals, the soles of the feet. Others bore carvings, grimacing faces, grim symbols etched into their iron arms, as though mocking the victim who sat within. In certain versions, water was poured over the condemned before heating began, the moisture making steam that blistered the skin as heat rose. It was not enough to kill quickly. It was designed to stretch torment into hours, until life itself begged to be abandoned. There are whispers of chairs equipped with mechanisms to press spikes deeper with every movement, punishing even the smallest attempt to shift. Victims would sit rigid, trying not to breathe too deeply, knowing each exhale made the spikes bite closer to bone. The silence of those chambers was punctuated not only by screams, but by the sound of sizzling flesh and the faint crack of skin splitting where spikes had pierced too far. Inquisitors in medieval Europe wielded this device with grim efficiency. Heretics, witches, traitors, all found themselves seated in thrones of iron. To the eye, it resembled a perverse parody of judgment. A prisoner placed in a chair, facing their accusers, but unable to speak, unable to rise, their body betraying every plea with the scent of burning meat. It was justice as theatre, cruelty elevated to ritual. The imagery lingers. A chair is supposed to be rest, comfort, the place where one sinks after toil. But here, it became the antithesis. To sit was to suffer. To be given a seat was not mercy but sentence. The more familiar the shape, the deeper the unease it inspired. Imagine being led into the chamber, the iron seat waiting in the glow of coals. You hesitate, your mind screaming at you to resist. But the guards force you down, straps tightening as spikes puncture your back, your arms, your thighs. At first the sting is sharp, scattered points of pain. But then the fire beneath begins to breathe. Warmth spreads, then heat, until every spike becomes molten. Your skin blisters where it touches metal, sears where iron presses hardest. The smell rises, undeniable, filling your lungs with your own undoing. You cannot move. You cannot flee. You are forced to remain seated, a guest in hell's throne, while time crawls slowly, minute after minute, hour after hour. And still, some survived. Not all punishments in the chair ended in death. Some were released, scarred, branded, maimed, allowed to walk back into the world carrying the memory of the fire. For rulers, this was a useful outcome. A living body marked by spikes and flame was a walking warning, a testament to what awaited any who strayed too far. Others were not so fortunate. Their bones fused to iron, their flesh cooked until nothing remained but charred remnants. The chair held them until the end, until silence finally replaced screams. Then the iron was scraped clean, reset, and made ready for the next. What made this punishment worse than death was not simply the pain of burning alive. It was the slowness, the intimacy. Fire was not a wall of flame, but a creeping hand, rising inch by inch, claiming the body gradually. The condemned could feel themselves being undone, not in one rush, but in dozens of small betrayals, the skin blistering, the muscles twitching, the nails cracking against restraints. Each moment promised relief, yet none arrived. The path forward still glows faintly, as though lit by coals that never die. The memory of the chair lingers, not just in history, but in the imagination. It reminds us how easily ordinary shapes, a seat, a throne, can be bent into tools of unimaginable torment. A symbol of power, twisted until it devours those who dare to challenge it. And so the corridor stretches on, shadows flickering in orange light. Somewhere in the dark ahead, you think you hear the faint sound of iron creaking, as though another chair waits, forever warmed by the fire that never goes out. The glow of iron fades as the path narrows, the heat behind you replaced by a dampness that seeps into stone. The air grows cooler, heavy with the smell of moss, brine, and something stagnant. Somewhere ahead, water moves, not the rushing of rivers or the roar of the sea, but the steady, patient drip of liquid collecting in dark places. The corridor opens into a chamber where the torchlight flickers against shifting surfaces, and you realise you're surrounded by water. Black pools stretch into shadow, their surfaces broken only by the occasional ripple, as if something beneath still stirs. Here lies another of history's cruelties. Not fire, not iron, but water. Silent, patient, merciless. For where kings and rulers desired judgment, drowning was often their chosen execution. And unlike the raging chaos of flame, water kills without spectacle. It does not shout. It suffocates in silence, pressing life out in slow, invisible hands. The punishments of drowning came in many forms, each designed to erase rebellion, to swallow crime in the most natural of graves. Sometimes it was rivers that bore witness, their currents carrying condemned bodies downstream as warnings to all who watched. Other times it was still ponds, wells, or pits, turned from sources of life into places of terror. And then there were the seas, vast and endless, where punishment meant not just death, but disappearance. The cruelty was not only in the act of drowning, but in the ceremony around it. In medieval Europe, women accused of crimes, especially of witchcraft, adultery, or infanticide, were often given to the water as part of justice. Bound hand and foot, they were cast into rivers or lakes to prove their innocence or guilt. The twisted logic was simple. If they floated, the water had rejected them, marking them guilty to be punished further. If they sank, the water claimed them as innocent. But by then, innocence meant nothing, for the lungs had already filled. Either way, the water was judge, jury, and executioner, and the condemned could do nothing but struggle against it. Some rulers turned drowning into spectacle. In the canals of Renaissance cities, convicts were tied in sacks weighted with stones, their bodies lowered gently into the depths as crowds gathered on bridges above. The silence of the act unnerved onlookers. There was no scream, no clash of weapons, only bubbles breaking the surface, then fading until nothing remained. The water closed without a trace, as though swallowing the crime itself. In ancient Rome, a particularly cruel variation was reserved for those who had committed parricide, the killing of one's parent. The condemned was sewn into a sack alongside animals, a dog, a rooster, a viper, and an ape. This strange gathering was then thrown into the river, where thrashing claws and fangs tore into the prisoner even as water filled their lungs. It was not just death, it was chaos, an image of nature turning against the unnatural crime. To be drowned alone was horror enough. To be drowned in the company of frightened, furious animals was to be torn between madness and suffocation. But even without ritual, the act itself carried more than enough terror. Drowning is not sudden. It is slow betrayal by the body. The lungs resist at first, holding breath until pain burns in the chest. Panic surges, muscles thrash, the mind screams for air. And then, inevitably, the mouth opens and water rushes inward. It floods every passage, fills every cavity, choking and burning. The body convulses, fighting even as it loses, until at last it goes still. Few punishments strike so directly at the primal instinct to breathe. Few force surrender so completely. The corridors around you echo with the stories of those lowered into water, not as criminals but as warnings. Entire groups of rebels were chained together, stones tied around their waists, and cast from ships into the sea. The water received them without hesitation, dragging dozens down at once, their cries muffled into silence beneath the waves. In some kingdoms, drowning was considered more merciful than fire or the wheel. But mercy is a strange word here. It did not save lives. It only ensured the end came without blood. But for those who endured the last moments, the panic, the choking, the endless black surrounding them, there was no mercy at all. And there were those who were drowned slowly, cruelly, as if water itself could be commanded to toy with its victims. Some were tied to stakes at low tide, left as the sea crept forward. They watched the horizon darken, the waves inch closer, lapping first at their feet, then their knees, then their chest. Hours passed as the tide rose. The condemned felt every stage of their burial, saw their grave come toward them, not from earth, but from water. By the time the waves reached their mouths, madness had already begun to set in. To choke in darkness after such anticipation was its own punishment. Water was the king's justice because it was absolute. Fire left ashes, iron left bones, but water erased. Bodies disappeared into rivers, floated out to sea, were never found. For rulers, this was useful. No grave to visit, no remains to revere, only absence, a silence that warned others to obey. Imagine standing bound at the edge of a dock, the rope rough against your wrists, the stone tied to your ankles heavy and unrelenting. The crowd watches as guards push you forward. You fall into cold water, its surface breaking with a crash that echoes in your skull. For a moment, there is light above, rippling, fragile. You kick, you thrash, but the weight pulls you down. The surface grows smaller, dimmer, until it vanishes altogether. Then there is only darkness. Your chest burns, your body convulses, and the water does not care. It holds you, presses you deeper, until thought itself drowns. This is why drowning was worse than death alone. It was not just the end of life, but the stripping away of presence. No pyre to mark your passing, no body to carry, no tomb to remember. Only disappearance. You became one with the river, the lake, the sea, leaving nothing behind but ripples that quickly faded. The chamber around you grows colder. Drips echo, rhythmic as a heartbeat. The black pools stretch endlessly, reflecting faint light like unblinking eyes. And though the water lies still, you can almost hear the muffled cries beneath, sealed away where no one can reach. The king's justice was not always swift, not always fair, but it was always final. Water leaves no appeal. It accepts everything, and it keeps what it takes. The path continues forward, skirting the edges of the pools. The sound of dripping follows you like a second shadow, and though your steps remain dry, you feel the weight of unseen depths below. Somewhere in that silence, the memory of countless drownings lingers, rising and falling like a tide that never ends. Under the dim light of an early dawn, when the fog clings heavy to the fields and the trees stand like watchmen wrapped in silence, the outline of a human figure sometimes appeared where it should not. Suspended high above the earth, hanging like a grotesque lantern, was a man, or what was left of him. His body stiff, unmoving, bound within a frame of iron. A cage not meant to hold him in life, but to parade his slow decay in death. Travellers passing by would stop in silence, for there was something about the sight that did not allow laughter or chatter. The man inside no longer breathed, yet in some way he had not been granted the peace that usually came with the grave. He had been condemned to a second sentence, to remain in the world, but no longer of it. This was the punishment of gibbeting, iron cages that clung to the body, locking it upright, suspended from a pole or tree for all to see. They were not built for movement. Once placed inside, the condemned was either already dead, or placed there alive, and left to discover how long a human body might survive without food, without water, without rest. Hours turned into days, days into silence. A second death took hold, one that carried no mercy. Unlike the swift cruelty of the axe or the sharp crack of a rope, this punishment was designed for permanence. It was not enough for the condemned to die. They had to remain, to haunt the roadways and the village edges, a constant reminder that punishment reached beyond breath. To those who passed beneath, the caged body whispered without words, "This is what becomes of the disobedient. Even death will not hide you from us." Iron cages were crafted to fit the shape of a man, often crudely hammered together by blacksmiths. Some were simple, no more than 2 bands of iron locked across the chest and waist, enough to keep the corpse upright. Others were elaborate, encasing the entire body, wrapping around the arms, the ribs, even the jawbone, so that the body inside was suspended in a rigid mockery of life. When the cage swung in the wind, the bones clattered against the metal, echoing like a warning bell over the fields. The punishment carried a kind of double edge. It tormented the condemned, and it tormented those who had to live in its shadow. Farmers who worked the land near a gibbet would mutter their complaints, not out of pity for the man inside, but because the stench of rotting flesh did not respect boundaries. A hot summer could carry the smell for miles. Children grew up beneath these blackened silhouettes, pointing at them, whispering stories about the lives once lived within. For them, death was not something hidden behind church walls or sealed in coffins. It was there, in the air they breathed, hanging above them like a constant threat. The condemned inside, if alive when placed there, faced one of history's most cruel forms of waiting. They could not sit, could not lie down. The body pressed always against cold iron, and the sky became their only ceiling. Rain soaked them, wind cut them, sun burned them, and when the night came, silence stretched too wide, broken only by the flapping of birds that circled above. Some accounts tell of men begging for death, their voices carrying down into the village, their bodies rattling against their cage with every attempt at movement. But the cage gave no mercy, no blade, no fire, no rope was needed. It let the air itself become the weapon. And then came the birds, always the birds. Ravens and crows learned quickly what these cages promised. They perched above, waiting until the body no longer resisted. Then they descended. They tore at the soft parts first, the eyes, the lips, the tongue. The condemned, if still alive, could do nothing but endure the sharp tearing beaks, the flurry of wings. Even after death, the body remained a banquet until only bones clattered within the iron frame. But the cruelty did not end with flesh. For families, this was perhaps the greater torment. To be denied a burial was a punishment of its own. A grave was not just a hole in the ground. It was rest. It was dignity. It was belonging again to the earth. To be kept from the grave was to be kept from peace. The iron cage ensured not just the death of the body, but the denial of closure. Mothers, wives, children would pass beneath the cage, unable to look away, unable to reclaim what was theirs. In England, gibbeting was often reserved for those guilty of murder or treason, crimes seen as tearing apart the fabric of society. Pirates, too, frequently ended their lives in cages, hung along harbours and estuaries, so that every ship entering would be greeted by their swaying corpses. The sea breeze caught their bones and carried the sound across the water, as though the dead themselves whispered warnings to those who dared consider the same path. And still the cages remained long after the flesh had gone. Iron did not decay like skin or bone. Empty cages stood for years, sometimes decades, their frames blackened by weather, their bolts rusted, but their shapes unbroken. They became part of the landscape. A tree might be felled, a house might be built, but the cage endured. Children grew old seeing the same black shape on the horizon. The punishment outlasted even the memory of the crime. In this way, the cage replaced the grave. A man in life had been denied dignity, and in death, denied silence. The grave was meant to hide, to protect, to draw a veil between the living and the dead. The cage tore that veil open. It made a spectacle of decay, a permanent exhibition of shame. And worse still, it robbed even the bones of rest. While others lay beneath the soil, wrapped in prayers and silence, the caged body remained above, restless, unburied, denied the one thing every culture, every faith, every time has sought to give the dead: peace. When storms rolled in, Lightning sometimes split the sky above these cages, illuminating the rattling figures inside. A traveller on the road might look up, see the flash of bone and iron, and hurry their steps, muttering words to ward off evil. For it was not just the punishment of law. It had become, in the eyes of many, a punishment from something deeper, darker, older. And so the cage endured, not simply as a tool of punishment, but as a reminder that cruelty does not always end with death. Sometimes it continues long after, stretching across seasons, across years, until even the land itself seems to remember. The grave offers silence. The cage offers none. And that, perhaps, was the darkest sentence of all. The wind moves differently around ruins. Where walls once stood proud, now only stones remain. And yet those who walk among them feel a presence that does not belong to empty air. It is not just memory, it is the residue of voices, the echo of suffering pressed so deeply into the earth that even centuries cannot bury it. History records the dates, the decrees, the names of kings and judges, but it rarely writes the cries that never left the walls. Still, if you stand long enough in such a place, if you let the silence settle around you, you begin to sense that some punishments never ended. They linger, caught between time and oblivion. Not all cruelty was meant for the public square, nor for iron cages that swung above the roads. Some punishments were sealed away, hidden from the eyes of common folk, their horrors left to rot in corners of castles, towers, and prisons. There, within stone corridors too narrow for light, human beings were left to vanish. No burial, no body, no record. Only silence. And silence has a way of carrying itself across centuries, whispering through cracked walls, hanging over stones darkened with damp. The oubliette, its name born from the French word oublier, to forget, was one such place. It was not a prison cell in the sense we imagine. It was a hole, a narrow shaft cut into the earth, sometimes widened at the base, sometimes nothing more than a vertical grave. The condemned were lowered in or cast down and then abandoned. No food, no water, no light. The earth swallowed them whole. The oubliette did not kill quickly, it erased. Imagine the sensation of being lowered into such darkness. The rope creaking, the circle of light above shrinking with every moment, the faces of those who condemned you growing distant until they were only shadows against the sky. And then, blackness. The rope pulled back up. Silence. You shout at first, until your throat aches, until the stone walls answer you with nothing but a hollow echo. You press your hands against damp rock, searching for a seam, a weakness, but the stone does not yield. Time stretches. Hunger gnaws. Thirst burns. At last, the body sinks into weakness, and thought itself begins to fade. For those who designed these pits, the cruelty was precise. To die of thirst or starvation is one of the most harrowing ends. The body does not simply fail, it consumes itself. Muscles cramp, skin cracks, the tongue swells, the mind slips between delirium and despair. Days stretch into torment, and yet no blade, no fire, no visible wound marks the suffering. The oubliette left nothing behind but silence, and in that silence, time itself seemed to forget. But the stones remembered. Even centuries later, travellers who stumbled upon such shafts spoke of a strange heaviness, a feeling of being watched from below. The walls of certain castles still hold them, deep, narrow pits sealed off, no more than a small opening at the top. Tour guides today may drop a pebble down and wait, the sound echoing long after, as though the earth is swallowing it whole. In those echoes, one might imagine the last breaths of those who perished within. and not all who suffered in oubliettes were enemies of kings or killers by trade. Sometimes it was a punishment for betrayal, for whispers against the wrong man, for debts unpaid, for being inconvenient in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nobles sent rivals into those pits as easily as farmers threw stones at crows. Once cast inside, a man became nameless, lost to both family and record. The oubliette was not just a grave, it was an erasure, a blotting out. Yet even such hidden cruelties left their shadows across the centuries. In towns that grew near old prisons, rumours whispered of voices in the night, groans that rose from beneath the stones. Children dared each other to press their ears to the earth and listen. Travellers swore they heard faint scratching when passing by sealed towers. These were not the hauntings of imagination, they were echoes of suffering that time did not carry away. Other punishments, though more visible, carried the same kind of lingering presence. Consider the whipping posts, the pillories, the places where shame was carved not into stone, but into memory. To stand bound in the square, lashed by rope, or beaten by whips until the skin tore, was a pain that passed, but the humiliation endured. The faces of neighbours staring, the laughter of children, the cold eyes of enemies, all pressed upon the condemned like brands. When the wounds healed, the memory remained, echoing inside the mind, as though time itself refused to release them. And then there were those punishments meant to stretch across generations. Entire families marked by one man's crime. A thief hanged might still leave his wife and children condemned to poverty, their very names spat upon by neighbours. In this way, punishment became something larger than a body. It infected a bloodline echoing through sons and daughters who had never set foot inside a courtroom. The law was satisfied, the execution done, but the echo persisted, binding those left behind to a crime they had not committed. The cruelest thing about such punishments is that they never truly end. Death closes one chapter, but the echoes linger. They live in memory, in rumour, in the silence of places where men once cried out. A castle corridor, a village square, a field at the edge of town. Each holds a weight, invisible yet unmistakable. Travellers feel it, locals avoid it, and in that way the punishment stretches on, far beyond the life it was meant to end. Even now, centuries later, these echoes reach us. They remind us that suffering does not vanish with time. It clings, it reverberates, it shapes the way we see places and the way we carry stories. The ruins of prisons, the dark holes beneath castles, the rusted cages that sometimes still cling to lonely trees, all speak in their own way. They do not need words. They do not need witnesses. The suffering they once held remains, like a voice caught forever in the stone. And so, when we walk among ruins, when we see iron twisted by rust, when we feel a chill in places where no wind blows, we are reminded of this truth. Punishment was never only about death, it was about permanence. To strike fear not just in a man, but in a people. To leave scars not just on skin, but on memory. These scars remain, carried across centuries in silence, in shadow, in the echoes of suffering that time, for all its power could not quite forget. And so, the shadows grow still again. Tonight we have wandered through punishments that stretched beyond the body, torments that lingered longer than death itself. We've stood in dungeons that whispered with forgotten voices, sat before chairs that breathed fire, watched cages sway where graves should have been, and felt the weight of a king's justice sinking beneath the water, Each cruelty carried its own silence, its own echo. Now I wonder, which of these punishments stayed with you the most? Was it the drowning, where the struggle ended in breath stolen too soon? Or the cages, where suffering continued long after life had left the body? Or perhaps the whispers of those forgotten walls, where time itself seemed to hold on to pain? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read them in the quiet hours, when the world outside has gone to sleep, and each of you feels a little closer. And if you'd like to drift with me into more of history's darker corners, where stories are not shouted but softly remembered, be sure to subscribe. Your presence keeps these voices from being lost again. Until next time, sleep well, and let the past keep its watch while you dream.